perhaps like some of you, I come from a family of doctors. I'm the black sheep, actually, who isn't one. I started playing one on the radio. My grandfather, mother, uncle, siblings, cousins, all pretty much have MDs, or at least a DDS, a DVM. The only other exception besides me is my father, a retired businessman. And as a proud capitalist, Dad's fond of recounting the golden rule, which, as he says, he who owns the gold rules. So I think we're all pretty familiar with this principle and how it works in healthcare. The payers, the government, the insurance companies, the employers who retain the insurance companies, they've got the gold, right? They rule. Certainly a lot of doctors, patients feel that way. But I think we also know it's not quite that simple. Hospitals merge, physician groups are growing astronomically. Here in New York, unions are very powerful. So the healthcare providers, the payees, they don't start with the gold, but they often have a lot of leverage over controlling how much gold they get. And there's the drug companies as well. Also, they don't start with the gold. But for all the talk of patent cliffs and generics, pharmaceutical firms, large and small, they've got a lot of leverage, right? And more so here in the United States than probably any place else on the globe. And especially have leverage when they have new and uniquely powerful drugs, sometimes even when they have new and ambiguously powerful drugs. And in the middle of all this is, of course, the doctor and the patient. And that's what we're here today to talk about. There's a lot of, increasingly, there's RNs and PAs and NPs and care coordinators and social workers, but really it's still the doctor and the patient are at the center of healthcare, no matter how many other players are in the mix. So we're going to take a look at how that's evolving, how it's faring in the pressure to contain costs that everyone feels. And we're going to hone in on this last part, the pharmaceutical part, drug therapies, how these economic pressures are affecting pharmaceutical treatment choices. Patients look to doctors for the best advice. Doctors might not see cost-related discussions as their responsibility. They may not have adequate time for these discussions. They may not fully appreciate the financial ramifications of the treatments for their patients. We're going to take a look at fail-first policies, also known as step therapies. They're adopted by about 2/3 of insurance plans. They require patients to be treated with proven lower-cost medications before being approved for higher-cost drugs. The lower-cost one has to fail before they get the higher-cost one. And less expensive treatments often do work perfectly well. Time and again, research shows that they don't work for everyone. How do physicians explain these policies to their patients? Many of whom, of course, forge strong opinions on what they need from their web searches or from direct-to-consumer advertising. What's the impact on the patient-caregiver relationship if patients experience serious side effects as a result of taking medication not recommended by their physicians, or suffer delays in receiving treatment because they're in between going from drug A to drug B, the less expensive to the more expensive one. How do these dynamics affect clinicians' feelings of professionalism? Do they contribute to caregiver stress and burnout? Do they help or hinder the patient-caregiver trust, communication, and relationship building?
Being the president of U.S. Pain Foundation, as well as a person with pain, I've lived through step therapy myself, and we see people with chronic pain in many disease states. Pain covers many disease states, so we see many people come to us that go through step therapy processes. It's very effective on a person with pain and patients in general, because you have that trust with your doctor. The doctor's giving you the best care as possible. So you go to your doctor and you speak to your doctor, and the doctor says, your physician says, this is what I feel is your best course of action. And you go and your insurance says, we don't feel this is your best course of action. So it's very demeaning to you. It's very hard to understand. This is my doctor telling me this is the best course of action for myself. How can you tell me this is not the best course of action? And we know for a fact that the longer you're in a state of pain, the longer you're going to be in a state of pain, because you're not getting the appropriate care. And this was the case with myself. I went through a step therapy process 3 times. And it took almost 6 months to get the therapy and treatment that my doctor felt was the best course of action. And this delay of care cost me a lot of my life, cost me a lot of time. It put me in a state of depression. It gave me a sense that nobody was out there for me. It made me and it caused my pain to be terrible. In fact, by the time I went to the correct course of action, it was just enough instead of being appropriate, because I was in such a state of pain for so long, failing on different various medications that my doctor didn't even think were suited for me, but the insurance company sadly thought that was the best. So, we see that a lot, and one of the things we do advocate for, along with other organizations, is working for people to have access to the treatments that their doctor feels is the best appropriate for them. And we see it a lot from physicians. They're under a huge strain from the patient, from a patient looking at the physician, because we go back to them and say, well, I need your help. And they say they want to help, but they're such under a strain already with the healthcare system that we're given, that this is another burden on them to try to explain to you why this is happening and how to fight for you to get the appropriate care. And it takes a while. It's not as easy as some insurance companies will say when they say, well, if you fail within 7 days, go back to your doctor and you'll get what you need. In reality, it takes 2 weeks to get another appointment. It takes that much longer to go back. You can't just call your doctor and say it didn't work. You have to be reassessed. So the reality is, it's a really bad burden on people with pain and patients in general. And it's delaying care intentionally and hurting many patients.
The perspective I want to take on this question today is something which reflects what I do all day long, which is we think about what will care be in the future and how can we incorporate the principles that Ken wrote about in A Patient's Story in the care of our patients, and how will the efforts to control cost impact the doctor-patient relationship. So a couple of realities. As everyone said to start with, and I don't think you'll find any disagreement on this panel, everyone recognizes that we do have to rein in the growth of cost in our healthcare system. Demographics, economics, it will happen. It has to happen. Otherwise, our country will go bankrupt, and our country won't go bankrupt. So we all recognize that this is going to happen. How do we do this in a way that does not threaten the essential interactions between healthcare providers and patients? And how do we do this in a way that allows us, that trains healthcare workers to become better at connecting with their patients? And I want to use an example today to tell you about something which we're working about in oncology. I know Diane's here, and a bunch of you might also be involved in the cancer world. But right now, Medicare has announced a new model for cancer care called the Oncology Care Model. And it's in its early form, and there are problems with it, and it's going to be tweaked like a lot of Medicare demonstration models. But essentially, what it will look like, and I have no doubt that something like this will actually happen, what it will look like is they will say to oncologists, we will give you an extra payment, $1,000 per patient for 6 months. And we will give you the same amount of money to take care of them as you historically have used to take care of the patients. If you can save money, that's terrific. If you spend more money, then there will be upside risk eventually. But tied to this cost containment model is that you have to meet 10 key quality indicators. And for the first time, the quality indicators are ones that actually resonate with me. The quality indicators are that your patients with cancer won't go to the emergency room. The quality indicators are that your patients with cancer will be exposed to a palliative care doctor before the last 2 weeks of their life. The quality indicators are that hospice will be something that will be discussed with patients earlier in the course of their illness. So as a cancer center director, those resonate with me. To me, those indicate better quality cancer care. Now, where does the Schwartz Center come in, and where does connection with patients come in? It comes in because right now, I believe oncologists are ill-equipped to do this. There's a reason why 35% of patients with cancer get chemotherapy within the last month of their life. No one would want to pay for chemotherapy in the last month of someone's life, knowing that they're going to die. But it's much easier for an oncologist to say, let's try 9th line therapy with such and such a drug, rather than having the difficult discussion, that hospice and palliative care might really be the best thing you can do. And when I was at Mass General, a study led by Jennifer Temmel, who's an investigator at MGH, showed that if you get palliative care earlier in the course of your disease, you actually live longer from your cancer as opposed to living shorter. So cost containment will force doctors and nurse practitioners to get better at having these difficult discussions. I don't think the medical system right now is at the point it needs to be to have these difficult discussions. And I think the Schwartz Center constantly tells us and teaches us the importance of that connection. And if we're going to save money with the oncology care module, we're going to need to have a better ability to have those conversations.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm in awe of the work that the Schwartz Center has been doing. However, I feel a little lonely here as potentially the only defender of step therapy. I realize that I probably won't leave with very many new friends here today. But let me start by saying that even though I've worked for many managed care companies as a good part of my career, I am all for passionate, compassionate patient-physician relationships. However, I would argue that step therapy does not impinge on that relationship, and in fact, sometimes it can be actually a positive force. First of all, how we call things has a big influence about how we think about them. So let me ask, what is fail-first therapy? I've never heard step therapy actually called fail-first therapy. Calling it fail-first is similar to, I think, what the Republicans would call a discussion around palliative care death panels. Why we would label this approach as fail-first? How is this any different than any other medical guideline that's core to how physicians practice? Would we say that a guideline that requires a person that with back pain to first have rehabilitative therapy before surgery, would that be fail first? Would we call something, if we require diet and exercise before gastric bypass surgery, would that be fail first? I view step therapy as any other guideline that physicians that practice first-class medicine would follow. When guidelines are developed by any medical society or any entity, shouldn't they consider financial factors? And if there's an equivalent alternative at 1/10 the cost, wouldn't it be logical as well as ethically and financially appropriate to utilize the less costly option? In fact, a number of medical societies are now including cost effectiveness as part of their guideline development, including the American Cardiology Society. It's also worth reviewing some of the facts around step therapy. Without going into great detail, these guidelines are developed primarily by pharmacy management companies using a panel of outside clinical experts. They're primarily used to assure generic drugs are used prior to expensive brand name drugs when they're available. The FDA recently came out with a consumer guide that basically states that generic drugs have the same quality and performance as brand name drugs. At Caremark, one of the country's largest PBMs, usually about 15% of the brand name drugs, meaning 85%, are not actually requiring step therapy. Only 15% require step therapy. Of those individuals that go on step therapy, only 2% actually end up going back on their brand name drug. Interestingly, also, a recent study in the Annals of Internal Medicine showed that those individuals that start on generics are 6 times more likely to be compliant than those that start on brand. Even more importantly, that improvement in compliance has led to an 8% improvement in clinical outcomes. So clearly price matters to patients, and ignoring its impact can lead to adverse clinical outcomes. For a physician to ignore the impact of costs on a patient, I believe, is not really truly fulfilling his duties. And that's not only true if the managed care company is paying for the cost. What happens if the patient is paying for the difference? And what if that patient is poor and has to decide between drugs and other essential things like food? Finally, I would say that in an ideal world, medicine and money would have nothing to do with each other, and money would not influence the practice of medicine. However, medicine accounts for 18% of our GDP, and any unnecessary money spent on medical care is not available to be spent on social services like education, housing, as well as defense, and maintaining our country's infrastructure. We also know that money influences how physicians practice. For example, physicians that have a financial interest in an echocardiogram machine or a CAT scanner utilize it much more than those that do not. Pharmaceutical companies have also made many wonderful medications. However, in 2010, they also spent $27 billion, or almost 1% of the total cost of healthcare, or 20 times their research costs, on influencing prescribing behavior through marketing and advertising. Believe me, they're not advertising for generic drugs. So let me end by saying that the patient-physician relationship is not one that's in a bubble isolated from the realities of the world. Cost of treatment should clearly not be the focus of the relationship. However, just like a physician must look beyond the pure clinical situation and consider the social and personal needs of a patient, isn't it really more compassionate to the patient and to society if they also consider the cost of the treatment that they're prescribing?
I'm with you, Aaron. I'm going to defend this.
Great. I'm not so lonely.
Well, I'm going to defend the purpose of it, not necessarily the way it's conducted. That's where we have some problems on execution. But during my years at Medco, I was there when many of these types of utilization management programs were put in place. This step therapy is just one of many. The idea of utilization management is that there are drugs in any plan that can be used within a scope of what the plan is meant to cover and outside of it. And that scope varies based on who's paying. Employers have a certain idea, health plans have a certain idea, unions have a certain idea, and it ranges based on that scope. And what they want to do is ensure that there's no unnecessary expenditures that go outside that scope. Now, even within the scope, there's opportunities to make sure there's no unnecessary expenditures. As Aaron's saying, there's plenty of situations where there's an array of options for a particular therapeutic approach that vary significantly in cost, or could be made to vary with competition in cost. And the question is it unreasonable to ask people when you have, through the process Aaron talks about, through using clinical experts and so forth, when you can say that some significant proportion of a patient population will do just fine on the lower cost. You may not know how to identify it, but you can expect that some proportion, and we used to debate this all the time, what is the proportion? Should it be 20%, 50% that we ask? And a lot of times we arrived at that number based on the severity, what the consequences were. Like Ron says, if they don't get it, they really have a problem. And so we would arrive at an approach that when we are satisfied there was a significant proportion, that we will put this in, that we will require for coverage that someone either has not done well with the therapy that's the lower cost, they either have a history of it, and this is why it shouldn't be fail first, I agree, or the physician has a good reason why even trying it is a bad idea, that the consequences of failing are too much to accommodate what the benefits are. That's when it's done correctly. So fail first actually is an improper term, even though it's meant to be inflammatory, but it's improper when these are executed correctly. So the question is it reasonable to ask people? And the answer is probably yes. And I'll tell you that the reason these programs like this started is because the payers came to places like Aaron's and when I was at Medco and said, we can't cover this class of drugs, period, unless we know there are ways to reduce exposure unnecessary costs. Take the rheumatoid arthritis drugs. There's some very expensive biologics that are very effective, but there's some really inexpensive drugs that can be as effective in some patients. These expensive drugs cost as much as tens of thousands of years. The other drugs are just, a few dollars. And so the payers will often say, I can't cover these really expensive biologics unless I know that we can put some controls in place where I can not have to pay for those or not. So it's either we do this or I can't cover for anybody. And that's, so in some ways, in many ways, these programs enable coverage. And that's, and I think we can all understand that and accept that at that conceptual level. Where it falls apart is execution. Because it's left sometimes to mindless bureaucrats who think these are just very straightforward rules and that they don't stop and think about the concept, don't think about what the intent is, don't think about the consequences that it poses on patients. Ron's situation, I'm sorry, Paul. Paul, your situation was there were consequences if it failed, and that should have been accommodated a priori, and that's a problem. There's sometimes when the time of adjudication of these things is a threat in and of itself. There have been classes of drugs where the time to adjudicate that is itself a threat and therefore should not be in these programs. So that's the basic idea. Should physicians be able to articulate this so clearly and defend it? No. But they probably should know and be able to at least discuss with the patient the general purpose of these, which is to try and the lower cost, if at all clinically possible, so that these therapies are available when you really need them.
If there's one thing that we can all agree on, and hopefully everybody in this room would agree on, is that cost control of the healthcare system is an important and urgent issue, and everyone has a role in it, and everyone is subject to pressures in it, and that includes drug companies, it includes insurance companies and payers, it includes doctors, and it includes patients, and we all sooner or later are in that last category, and I think all of us don't necessarily keep cost issues in mind as we play the different roles in the system. But as we look at it, so from a company that's developing drugs and bringing them to market, we have somewhat of a different perspective. I think that what we share is the responsibility with everyone here and there to play a role in being sensitive to costs. And we view step therapy, it's not something that's directly impacting us, so I will tell you that I'm coming at it from a somewhat more objective position as a company, because our main drug is not, in fact, generally subject to step therapy, so I don't have an axe to grind on that front. But certainly we see it, and I think I view it more broadly as it's one of the tools that are in the cost control battle, and it shouldn't be the only tool. Does it have a role in some places? Is it appropriate in some situations? But I think we need to look at it more broadly, because it's not going to be one answer is going to solve every problem that we have in the healthcare system. And if we try and use one tool exclusively, we're absolutely going to see situations like Paul's and others where we're not getting the best quality of care in the battle over costs. To give you a sense of what we see, so as Fred mentioned, we're primarily focused in neurology, and we tend to work with patients and physicians who are dealing with very complex and chronic diseases. And essentially what that translates to is patients who are having, from the point of diagnosis, can be having a lifetime of care and are often on multiple drugs. So their care is very challenging. They may be seeing one primary drug as doctor as their neurologist, but they tend to also see other specialists or primary care physician as well, which means that their care is fractionated. So when you start having discussions about costs, you start having questions about paying for drug as well as other therapies, you start getting into challenging issues, because you have one doctor who's focused on one aspect of a condition, and you may have another doctor who's focused on another aspect of a condition. And if we're talking about, can a patient afford to pay for a drug, which of the drugs is the most important, and which ones is the patient going to pay for? Now, what we see, particularly in the space we're in, but I think it's increasingly common, is that patients are very well educated nowadays. We find that, for example, multiple sclerosis patients, they know about drugs before they're on the market. They're following the clinical trials, they're following the research. So when a drug is on the market, patients are walking into physicians' offices and saying, this is the drug that I want. So the old days of doctor having more controls by perhaps not mentioning a higher cost option and the patient just assuming they're getting what the doctors think is best for them, that's not an option anymore, because patients know there are alternatives out there. And that clearly is creating pressure points for physicians. We hear from a lot of physicians who talk about the fact that, as Fred mentioned in his introduction, they simply don't have enough time to spend with patients, and that's certainly true when you have very complex conditions. And so to try and insert in the middle of a complex discussion about patient care, a very sensitive discussion about whether or not a patient can afford therapy is very, very challenging. We hear that from physicians. We hear from patients that they feel that they've been abandoned because they don't know which decisions they should be making, and not in terms of should they be paying for a more expensive drug or not. And so all in all, there are a lot of stress points on particularly patients and physicians within the system, as well as everyone else. I think as a company, For example, we, like many others, are looking for solutions which include providing patient support services to help them in both their conditions as well as dealing with reimbursement, finding other means of reimbursement. We also provide financial support for payment for patients, including providing free drug for patients who can't afford it. And for our main drug, we have a program where a patient can get the first 2 months of drug free, so that if it doesn't work for them, that's been our skin in the game, and patients can move on to something else. If it does work for them, then they can move on to regular therapy. So I think there are a lot of potential solutions here, but there obviously also are a lot of challenging issues that all of us are having to deal with.
I don't see them as much different than any other clinical pathway that we're going to be forced to look at. And so their clinical pathway is being designed for all kinds of disease states and all kinds of ways we treat people. The question is, are the drugs really equivalent? That's always an important question to ask. And the other question is, if you're going to do step therapy and sequentially go through therapies, the assumption is that the more expensive drug is always better and that the cheaper drugs might be worse, and that's not always true. The other issue is, it's not like doctors get it right the first time, even without pathways, okay? I don't want to blow everyone's idea of medicine, but we get it wrong a lot. So even without step therapy, someone like Paul might have gotten the wrong treatment first. And the idea of sequentially trying different agents is a big part of medicine. It's a big part of the way we take care of patients. So to think that we might consider cost and resource utilization as part of that, it is not insane in my mind. It's not crazy, as long as it's done correctly, and as long as, for rheumatoid arthritis that was mentioned, as long as the biologic doesn't save the joint. What if the biologic saves the joint and prevents a joint replacement down the road, whereas giving the cheaper therapy up front might relieve symptoms as well? And that's where patient-centered outcome research and long-term data will be critical to be able to tell that.
I think one of the problems with these is the way that the companies do present them to the patients. Like as Paul was saying, Paul's impression was that the insurer was contradicting his physician's opinion and approach to the best way. And I can understand why, because I would see these letters go out saying, this is really the best way to do it clinically. But that's not the point of the program. It's to point out where there could be an equivalent. Could be. It's asking the doc to assess this. There could be a different way of doing it that's less expensive. But too often, the plans and the PBMs are so afraid of saying that it's about a cost measure, and so they throw in some notion that this is about the best approach of care. Well, it's not. I never let our communications suggest that this is a better therapy. How would I know when I'm dealing, Medco had 60 million covered lives, every physician in the country, how the hell would I know? I don't have the medical record. I haven't talked to the patient. I don't know. So don't say that you do. And this is where I think the tension comes in with the patient-physician relationship with these.
But what about what Tom was discussing, that there will always be failure in trial and error? Is that something? I mean, people can sort of understand that conceptually, but
yeah, you understand it conceptually until you're in the predicament and you don't want to be the trial and error. I mean, basically, you understand it as a whole, but as a patient, do you want to be the one that has to go through that trial and error? So I would say no. I would think most people would say no.
And others, I wonder how you feel about the quality of information that doctors are getting and the ways they evaluate medications, particularly new ones, but even long-standing ones. We're in an era where many of the drug company perks have been trimmed. Some of the lavish dinners and all expense paid trips. Nonetheless, there continues to be evidence that various factors influence doctors' prescription decisions. What do you think about what's going into those decisions and how biased or unbiased they could potentially be? Russell, maybe?
Well, I walk a mile in their shoes. There's obviously a lot of good information out there, how easy it is for physicians to access it with time and everything else. I don't think there's great information for them on how to navigate all this stuff. And in fact, it's so darn frustrating like I said, the clunkiness, as you said, is clunky, and the frustrations are driving them out of certain centers. I know this. Maybe you've seen it at Yale, but I know at various centers, just dealing with this stuff they are leaving, and so it's a real threat. It's just not an irritant. It's a real threat.
Along those lines, doctors aren't educated in the cost of treatment. So I run a major cancer hospital, a major research cancer center, and until 6 months ago, I couldn't have told you how much it actually costs to give our most common regimen in lung cancer. Okay, so there's an enormous gap between what you guys do and what I do, and we need to make that something that doctors can at least have some understanding of cost, because obviously, you know, the way we get our information, New England Journal does not include cost calculations on a brand new drug that's coming out for MS or a brand new drug that's coming out for lung cancer. So that's, I think, if we're going to start using cost considerations, we have to educate physicians on how to do that.